As the United States gears up for elections next week, we zoom in on the U.S. relations with the African continent under the outgoing President Joe Biden. When he took office, the U.S. president committed to strengthening its relations with Africa. But the question remains, is the continent's relations with the U.S. strengthened under President Biden? To help us answer this and other related questions, I am now joined by Professor Christopher Isike, a director for African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria. Professor Isike, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I guess the question remains, has outgoing President Joe Biden strengthened relations between the United States and Africa during his tenure?
Well, thank you for having me, Massa, and good evening to your viewers. A simple answer is yes and no. Yes, in terms of the fact that if you compare U.S.-Africa relations under his predecessor, President Donald Trump, you will see that there's been much more engagement between Africa and the U.S. under Biden, especially considering that he proposed a doctrine of equal partnership with Africa, viewing Africa's increasing, rising agency in international affairs as something to reckon with. So if you look at these engagements, a number of them, you would see that there has been indeed some kind of reset of U.S.-Africa relations under Biden. However, old notions and traditions have remained in terms of juniorizing Africa and the traditional paternalistic view of engaging with Africa has essentially remained.
And I guess, Professor Isike, talking about the juniorization and the old ways of looking at Africa as well, one of the examples that one could use is the U.S. Encouraging and saying it will support two African states joining the UN security with 2 seats there. But then those 2 African countries wouldn't have veto powers anyway.
Exactly. And that's a problem, because if indeed Africa is viewed from a lens of equal partnership and regarded as such, there will be no reason why it goes into a Security Council, even if it's 1 or 2 states, and assumes a junior partnership in terms of not having the same powers as the 5 that have had these powers, since 1945. So that is a good indicator of the kind of argument we are making about the mismatch between the rhetoric and practice or action of the notion of equal partnership.
Yeah, and some have described it as, the U.S. or the Biden administration talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. Let's talk about that U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, which was held back in December 2022. 49 African leaders went there. There was much fanfare, much excitement about it. Fast forward 2 years later, Professor Isike, would you say that the U.S. has achieved what they wanted to out of that summit, and Africa has benefited what was promised out of that summit?
Well, in many ways they have. They've kept good on the promises. Over 80% of the funds that were promised have been allocated. We're talking about $55 billion in investments, which will push on until 2025. So many of these have been realized, and the core countries that they had bilateral meetings and agreements with, including Angola in this instance, and this explains one of the reasons why it's going to Angola. You will see there's been a lot of movement in this regard. The problem, again, remains the fact that there were no discussions or consultations with Africa on what should have constituted the agenda of the summit, and maybe if the U.S. really was serious about the doctrine of equal partnership, that summit would have been better held in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, where one president and his wife comes down, to Africa in Ethiopia to meet with 54 presidents and their spouses. That would have been much more meaningful in terms of the idea of equal partnership, are also offering the opportunity for Biden to have visited Africa much, much earlier in his term. So we would not be talking about Angola today as the first country to visit in Africa if he had gone to Ethiopia to have the UN Africa Leaders Summit in December of 2022.
Interesting point as well. But also when you're listening to the different messagings coming out of the campaigns, you know, when you're listening to the former president of the US, Donald Trump, and when you're listening to the vice president, Kamala Harris, are you hearing Africa as a theme that is prominent enough, or has it been sort of sidelined?
Well, not quite. Both candidates have really not focused on Africa per se, and again, it's also an indicator of how the country generally views the continent. But you would say that if Harris were to win the elections, she would be much more favorable towards the continent in terms of the idea of the equal partnership, which she was part of crafting. She herself visited Zambia in 2023. And so you would see some movement in terms of deepening ties and relations with the continent in a move to, of course, contain China and Russia. But not so with Trump, who has generally approached Africa with, condensation, and as well as not even seen Africa worthy of his engagement, except when he has any direct benefits. So that kind of transactional approach is what you would get from a Donald Trump if he were to become president. But let's be sure that either way, whether it's Trump or Harris, the United States national interest will remain tops in their engagement. And I dare say that none of these countries, whether it's the US, China, or Russia, really have Africa's interests at heart. They are just here to get what they can. And this speaks to why, as Africans, we must be able to organize ourselves in such a way that we're able to benefit from this courtship that we are seemingly getting now from superpowers in the continent.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those insights, Professor Isike. That is Professor Christopher Isike from the University of Pretoria.